started. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to all from International Dyslexia Association, Northern New England Alliance, which is serving Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. My name is Susan Horahan, and I'm the current president of IDA-NNEA. Welcome to our Read for Parents webinar featuring nationally renowned and esteemed educator, administrator, and speaker, Joan Sedita. So happy to have you here with us, Joan.
Thank you.
As a branch, we're thrilled to provide these every other month Read for Parents webinars, which focus on different IDA fact sheets and areas of interest to families and educators. The IDA fact sheets are a great tool in informing families and professionals alike on the journey of dyslexia. As many of you parents and practitioners can probably relate, getting structured literacy instruction for students in need is more often than not a difficult journey for parents, students, and teachers. As a branch, we're honored to bring these informative sessions to you as we work to bring structured literacy to all students in all classrooms, and especially to those who struggle. To support today's session, we have a team of board members that are helping. Andrea Pollack is managing the technical aspects of our webinar. Chris Riley, who's the vice president, will be adding links and resources in the chat. Heidi, you want to wave Heidi? Heidi will facilitate the questions and answers at the end as time allows. We do want you to note that certificates of attendance are not issued for these free Read for Parents webinars. During the session, please use the chat to ask questions, and at the end, we'll have maybe only 5 or 10 minutes today to answer questions. A lot of ground to cover. Today's webinar will be posted on our website within the next week. We do need a little bit of time to get that up and running. We'd like you to please consider joining our branch. There are many advantages, including connecting with our community, staying informed. There's great deals like IDA TV and the ability to expand your network. Our next Read for Parents will be April 12th, and that's the topic is to be determined. We're still working on putting the final touches on that. And then we will have another one June 14th and August 9th. There are a variety of membership levels, and one should surely fit your needs. Here's a list of the different membership levels that they have, and they offer different promotions at different times, so you might want to check back periodically. They do have teachers, if they're joining IDA for the first time, they can join for free. Our branch has a number of activities, including Read for Parents that you're at tonight, Wilson Collaboration, which we do 2 times each year. We'll have our annual virtual conference again in October of 2023. There's an annual Project Read webinar that'll start later this February. Our newsletters, our biggest newsletters, go out in February and August, and we do offer scholarships to our conferences. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Joan Sedita. Joan is the founder of Keys to Literacy, a literacy professional development organization working across the United States. Joan has been in the literacy field for over 40 years as a teacher, administrator, and teacher trainer. She is the creator of the Writing Rope framework and has authored multiple literacy professional development programs, including the Key Comprehension Routine, the Key Vocabulary Routine, Keys to Beginning Reading, Keys to Content Writing, Keys to Early Writing, and Understanding Dyslexia. Beginning in 1975, she worked for 23 years at the Landmark School, a pioneer in the development of literacy intervention programs. Joan was one of the 3 lead trainers in Massachusetts for the Reading First program and was a letters author and trainer. Joan received her master's in education and reading from Harvard University and her BA from Boston College. Welcome, Joan. Thank you.
Thank you. You're so welcome. Thank you, Susan, and to the Northern New England branch and all these wonderful women who volunteer their time to make this branch run. Give me a second, and I am just going to share my screen so we can take a look at the PowerPoints that I have planned for you this evening. Our topic tonight is the writing rope, a framework for writing instruction, which also happens to be the first part of title of a new book that Brooks Publishing published of mine this past August. And I know that, this is supposed to be a session primarily, or it started for parents, but I can see from the chat, a lot of you are also educators. So as we go through some of the suggestions, especially the instructional suggestions, I will try to point out those things that if you are a parent who are lucky enough to have your child let you help them, I'll try to bring some of those suggestions in as well. But I thought a good place to start before we jump into the components that make up writing instruction, which are also the drivers for the strands in the writing rope. I thought I should just call your attention to some research about what we know about effective writing instruction. And even though there's not as much research as we have as it relates to reading, we do have quite a body of knowledge and research that is accumulating. So if you want to learn more about this, there are 4 major reports. They're based on meta-analyses of the research that I strongly suggest you look into. I'm going to hit the mountaintops of what each one recommends, but basically Writing Next was the first to come out. Writing to Read, all you have to do is do an internet search of those titles, you'll get those. And then 2 more recent Institute of Education Sciences guides, Teaching Elementary School Students to be Effective Writers and Teaching Secondary Students to Write Effectively. Why am I starting with research? Because if we are going to teach kids in the most effective way, we want to make sure that it's based on what we know about what's most effective. And too often, this happens with a lot of things in literacy, but also in writing, too many teachers use what was used to teach themselves, right? Or they use a theory or something that's hot at the moment, or they're using whatever their friends are using. And we really want research to inform our instructional decisions. So I'm going to focus right now on the IES report, the elementary, and what were their major findings. That obviously we need to provide daily time for students to write. But sometimes in the elementary grades, we just assume that writing is going to happen during the ELA block and that's it. And it really should happen throughout the day. We also know we need to teach students to use the writing process. And in a little bit, I'm going to share something about that. It falls under one of my strands in the writing rope. We need to make sure that students are fluent in the underlying transcription skills of handwriting or keyboarding and spelling. And we also need to make sure that they know how to write a good sentence. And then finally, there are a number of things we can do that fall under engaging a community of writers. And this includes everything from providing opportunities for children to collaborate with their peers and with their teachers, opportunities to share their writing and celebrate their writing, regardless of whether there's mistakes or not, right? So there's a whole host of things that we can do to create an environment that motivates and engages kids to want to write. At the secondary level, their findings were, number 1, we need to explicitly teach specific appropriate writing strategies and skills. And I'm going to be hitting a lot of those in our session tonight. So as I go through each strand of the rope, I planned it so that there's at least one instructional practice that I give you to walk away with. And what this finding is emphasizing is that we need to be explicit. We can't make assumptions that even our students in high school, that they're going to figure these skills out on their own. And we want to use, they call it a model, practice, reflect cycle, but it's, if you're familiar with gradual release or the I do, we do, you do, it needs to follow that explicit cycle. We also need to make sure we're integrating writing and reading, and to use assessment to determine the individual levels and holes that some of our students may have in their writing ability. Now, the Writing Next findings, this identified 11 different things that we can do to teach that all of which are highly effective. And they listed them in the order that you see here. I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but we will actually talk a little bit about summarizing later when we talk about the critical thinking strand in the writing rope. We're going to talk about sentence combining when we get to the strand around syntax or sentences. And then finally, this report, the Writing to Read, took a look at everything that was out there up till that point, about how does having students write support their reading. And it turns out it does, not surprisingly, in many different ways. What this slide focuses on are those things that they found if you had students do the things that you see listed in red, they really supported reading comprehension. And note, you see the word summaries again, but teaching our kids how to take notes, right? How to answer and create questions. So some of that's going to come up in the critical reading strand. And I mentioned this at the start, the gradual release of responsibility, also known as IWU. So all of the things I'm going to share with you tonight and all of the sub-skills that I list in the writing rope, we want to make sure we teach them in an explicit way where the teacher thinks aloud how to do it, models it, provides lots of guided practice. One other thing before we sort of jump into the instructional practices, I wanted to address the issue of executive function and how, in order to write, it really challenges our executive function skills. So this is a model that Virginia Berninger and colleagues developed quite a while ago. This happens to be the 2006 iteration. And basically, what you'll notice is that, and they called it originally the simple view of writing, now they call it the not so simple view. But if you take a look at the top box, that's all the skills kids need to generate text. So it could be, how do you write sentences, words? How do you write longer pieces? How do you use transitions? How do you write a paragraph, right? We're going to talk about a lot of that stuff in the rest of this session. Down on the bottom left, you see the transcription skills, spelling and handwriting. Talk more about that. But what this model reminds us is that we can't forget that I think a lot of literacy skills tax executive function skills, but probably writing does more than anything. And Stephen Graham and Karen Harris and some of their colleagues who've done a lot around this, they developed some models called SRSD, really draw our attention to this. And so if you think about it, working memory really gets taxed while kids have to write. And they have to attend long enough, right, to stick with it, to get their thoughts on paper. They have to have goal setting and planning ability to plan before they write. They have to self-regulate to be able to revise and edit. So I want you to keep in mind that while we're going to talk about instructional practices, we always have to remember that a lot of our students who struggle with writing, some of it can be because of these issues. Now, these are processes. They're not skills. So you can't teach somebody to make their working memory better. What you can do is teach them and have them use supports like graphic organizers, right? Or lists of transition words. And those become scaffolds that help those students that have weak executive function skills. This little paragraph I borrowed from Graham Harris, and I think it sums it up nicely. So while negotiating the rules and mechanics for writing, the writer must also maintain focus on factors such as organization, form and features, purposes and goals, audience needs and perspectives, and evaluation of the communication between the author and the reader. And think of all those things that we have to do at the same time. So self-regulation of the writing process is critical. The writer must be goal-oriented, resourceful, reflective. For skilled authors, writing is a flexible, goal-directed activity, scaffolded by a rich source of cognitive processes and strategies for planning, text production, and revision. So keep that in mind as we go through the rest of the session. With this slide, I just wanted to highlight some of the most common things that we see for students who struggle with writing. And whether you're a parent listening tonight or you're an educator, as I review these, I want you to see, are there some other things that you tend to see? If so, jot them down into the chat box. So what will we see? They often lack critical reading skills. Comprehension and writing composing are so connected that you're going to see some difficulty with that. They tend to lack an understanding of grammar concepts, and the result is they write very short, stinted sentences, tend to all start the same way. They have a very difficult time editing their own writing or looking at the writing of peers and giving feedback, as well as a hard time identifying or creating a logical sequence of ideas. Their writing is just disorganized. Often lack a strong vocabulary, and so they don't bring in those rich words that can help the reader really convey to the reader what they're trying to say. And they very rarely use pre-writing or planning strategies. So that's why the instruction of pre-writing tools is so helpful for these students. So I'm assuming you've seen some of the same. And again, if you have a chance and there's something else you want to jot it in chat, that would be great. All right, so with that introduction, let me introduce the writing rope to you. Someone asked me, I did a podcast the other day, and they said, why did you use this metaphor? And for a long time, I actually used a different metaphor of a wagon wheel. And so you imagine a wagon wheel that's got lots of spokes in it. And if any one of the spokes is weak or is missing, what happens? The wagon wheel just, it can't hold the weight. But Hollis Scarborough's reading rope has now become so well known that I thought if I used a similar metaphor that it might resonate more with people. So I switched from the wagon wheel to the rope. Basically what you see here, and this is the beautiful colored version that Brooks Publishing put together for my book. My original is just a black and white drawing that I did one evening, but it serves the purpose. So there are basically 5 strands, and people say, you know, what is the purpose of this? It's to help educators and parents, right? When you're thinking about writing instruction, what are all the things that we need to make sure we include? So if you're looking at a curriculum that your building might have, or you're thinking about buying a writing program, you want to make sure that all of the items down that left side are covered somewhere. Because if they're not, then it's not a thorough writing program. What this represents, and all the various skills and strategies and scaffolds and tools that can go along with this, what they represent is what we know from the research as best practice. So that's how I really want people to look at it, to take stock of what you do for writing and ask yourself, am I doing enough work in the syntax strand? Am I doing enough work in the text structure strand? So basically, we're going to work our way up. We're going to start with writing craft and transcription. I'll share a little bit about each one. And as I said, I'm going to try to give you at least one tip for teaching related to them. And then we'll work our way up. So transcription, let's talk about that. I mentioned earlier that this includes handwriting, certainly spelling, which how do we develop spelling? We develop through phonics instruction that teaches us the orthographic system of the English language, how sound, symbol connect together, right? So if we've got sounds and words we want to write, what are the various options we have for spelling those sounds? And, you know, very often these are skills that are actually best taught during a phonics lesson. And ideally, we want children to enter grade 4 and up and have these things fairly fluent. Because if they're not fluent, what happens when they're trying to do that higher level critical thinking that has to do with all the items in the box on the right, if their transcription skills, getting the words just down on the paper or on the screen, if they're not fluent, they are going to spend so much time and energy on that they don't put the energy they need into organizing their ideas and getting out their best words. It's a little bit like, for those of you who know how decoding and fluency work with reading. If students are, if their ability to decode the words on the page is really labored and not fluent, they are putting so much so much of their energy into that decoding the words that they're not able to focus on the comprehension. So it's very similar. During writing instruction, and during writing block, we really want to put our attention to the composing part of this and hopefully take care of the phonics instruction when they're younger. And if they are older and still have phonics and spelling problems, we want to provide that through intervention. So here's something else that I have put in under the writing craft part of the rope. And that is an awareness of task, audience, and purpose when you're writing. If you think about it, when you write anything, it could be an email to a friend, it could be a grant proposal you're writing, maybe you're writing something for work. Proficient writers are always thinking about what's my task, especially who's my audience, and what's my purpose for writing. And that should really influence really important decisions that you have to make about what's the tone and the style and how long are you going to make it and how organized is it going to be and what words are you going to use. So this is something we can't assume that kids even know about. We always want to make sure we're very clear with them. When we give a writing task, we want to say, here's the audience and here's the purpose. For those of you that are in states that follow the Common Core, or maybe you have state standards that are very similar, there's a whole standard devoted to this in the writing standards. A little bit more about what I put under the strand that has to do with writer's craft. And this, by the way, is sometimes these things are called writer's moves. And probably besides phonics, out of all of the items in the writing rope, this is probably the one that mostly is in the purview of a writing or an ELA or English teacher. But it's often referred to as the art of writing. And this is basically anything that someone who's writing does on purpose, right, to make writing look or sound a certain way. It's decisions that writers make about your tone and your voice and your word choice. On this slide, I've actually kind of given you some more specific examples. So writer's voice is a big one. And it's what is the writer's unique style or emotion or personality you're trying to get across in your writing piece, which will depend on who your audience is. It's sometimes called writing from the heart and making the reader feel emotion. You know, you've all read something, I'm sure, that you're a page into it and it's trying to get you to become afraid. And you're actually like nervous and or there are things that you read and they make you cry. That's the ultimate in a writer's move. And we do that through our choice of language and dialogue. Things like first or second or third person, that also falls under writing craft. Word choice, being very purposeful and colorful in our language. And then, of course, any literary devices like using dialogue between characters or figurative language. So these are all highly sophisticated writers' moves that can be taught. Now, a big takeaway that I want you to have as you walk away from this section of the rope is the value of showing mentor models. Now, what does that mean? We all learn to improve our writing by emulating others. So, for example, if you've been in a car accident and you have to write out an accident report, if you've never written one, probably don't know how to do it. So oftentimes, wouldn't you say, can I take a look at a few other accident reports? And you look at how somebody else wrote them, and then you figure out how to do it yourself. That's the concept here. So if there is any skill or strategy, maybe you're teaching kids how to write, how to state a claim in an opinion piece, or how to use transition words, or how to use W words to expand their sentences. If we can, while we're doing that explicit instruction, show them some really good examples of mentor texts that they can look at it and say, oh, now I see how I do that. And then they basically are emulating that. So that's my big takeaway for the writing craft part of the rope. Use models for children to learn how to apply these skills and strategies. All right, now we're going to move up into the text structure strand. And I actually tucked quite a bit of items in under here. We're going to start with the broad, bigger picture and talk about the structure for longer pieces of text, or what are often referred to as the 3 types of writing. That would include opinion or argument, opinion in the earlier grades, argument in the upper, informational writing, and narrative writing. And, all of these have some similarities. So for example, some really common text structures are introductions, conclusions, and then there's body development. That's the structure of the main part of the piece. But they also have differences. So the way you propose your claim or your position for an introduction to an opinion piece is going to be different than how you introduce the topics and main ideas in an informational piece. And if we're doing an introduction to a narrative or a story, it might be more about introducing the setting or the character. And the way we build out the bodies are going to vary as well. We'll come back to that in a minute. The other thing I put under here is, now let's bring it down to a smaller level, and that's paragraph. There are many older students who struggle with writing because they still don't get what a paragraph is. And it's actually kind of unique to written language. When we are writing, we might be writing multiple paragraphs about the same topic, but every time we move to a new paragraph, we're signaling to the reader that it's time to shift. We're going to say something different about that topic. So in this paragraph, it's one main idea. Let's say we're writing about different kinds of pirates. So one paragraph might be about buccaneers. But then when we move to the next paragraph, we're writing about a different kind of pirate, right? So the whole concept of a paragraph is to signal to the reader. Now, this also has a converse in comprehension. A lot of students who don't get paragraphs when they're reading, they don't realize that when they see an indent, it's a clue that's telling them, hey, guess what? We're about to shift from one idea to another. So we want to teach kids about paragraph structure. And I'll show you a couple things on that a little bit later as well. The other thing that falls under text structure is teaching students about what often are referred to as patterns of organization. So when you describe something, the language you use is going to be different than when you are giving a sequence or when you're explaining cause and effect or compare and contrast. So those are specific structures that we want to make students aware of how those develop. And the very last bullet you see, linking and transition words, very tied to this. These are words or phrases. You all know them, right? First, second, last, however, therefore. They're words that for students who have low language skills, they don't come naturally to them. And so a lot of our students benefit from explicit instruction on how do we use them, because they make connections between our sentences and our paragraphs. And they're a really important feature of writing. So that's the text structure strand. In the big picture, I'm going to show you a couple of suggestions here. So if we focus on the three types of writing, students, by the way, really benefit from a very simple poster or anchor chart like this, right? It could be above their desk at home, or it could be in the classroom, to make sure they understand these three different types of writing and that they all have three different purposes. Also, that sometimes when we write, we might start writing informational, but then we might shift to an opinion, and we might even shift to narrative if we start telling the events of something. So sometimes writing combines all of them. Now, there's a particular graphic organizer that we've developed at Keys to Literacy that we've been using for quite some time. And in the schools and districts where we work, the teachers really take to it and they say it helps. So basically, there's two versions of it. It's a top-down, it's a topic web. Up at the top, you put the topic that you're writing about. If it's an opinion or argument piece or an informational piece, you put that topic up here, and then you begin by introduction, body, conclusion. Now, in your introduction, you have to, at the very least, tell the writer what you're writing about. So if you're writing about pirates, you might put a box under that that says pirates. If it's an opinion or argument piece, you have to state your opinion. So you might add another shape under introduction that describes your position. For the body, this is where you can build out something short and something long. And I have just a couple of classroom examples that will show you what I mean. Now, if the students are writing a narrative piece, then your default is going to be the title, and then it's going to be beginning, middle, end. Beginning is where you introduce the setting and the characters and maybe the narrator. The end is where you wrap it up, and if there was a problem, you give the solution. But the middle is the meat of your narrative, and that's where you're going to list your events in order. So let me just show you some classroom examples. Here's an informational topic web. It reminds the student they've got to tell us what the topic is at the beginning. In the conclusion, they're going to restate it and provide some sort of closure. But you can see the body is sharing that the student is probably going to have 4 body paragraphs, and each one is going to be about a different main idea. Now this is a generic version. And let's say we're writing something longer that had maybe 8 paragraphs. They could be broken into sections, and you see where it says subtopic, that's where the student would actually insert a heading in their informational piece. So here you see an example from a middle school classroom. This child is developing and planning the writing piece before they begin writing. And you can see, stating the introduction, it's about how rocks are formed. And then how many sections? It's going to have 3 sections. First, looks like it's going to have about 2 paragraphs. Second, we'll have 3, so on and so forth. This is one from a high school classroom. This also is broken up into 3 sections. You can have as many sections as you need. Now, here's what it looks like for an opinion piece. The student not only has to tell you what they're writing about, but give you what their position, what is it that they're arguing. Now, opinion and argument is structured differently than information. It's structured around the reasons you can give to support your opinion and the evidence that supports each reason. So in this case, this would represent a plan for an opinion, and the student is going to give 3 different reasons to back that up. So it might have 3 body paragraphs. So here you actually can see one. The student is making a claim. Students should have 2 recesses a day. You can see the 3 reasons. Now, when they go to write this up, they will, of course, turn all of this into multi-sentences and paragraphs. Now, if you're talking about argument in the upper grades, we also might be adding a counterclaim and a rebuttal. And so that you can see in the body. And here you can see an example that actually has a counterclaim and rebuttal. This one is only going to give 2 reasons. And then finally, I mentioned about narrative. This gets mapped out so that all the major events in your narrative, it could be fictional narrative, it could be someone's biography, but the body is driven by events. So that's my takeaway for a teaching tip for big structures. I want to share a couple things about paragraph structure. We often assume that kids know what a good paragraph is. I mentioned that before, but also sometimes we make a mistake with younger children and we say a paragraph will always start with a topic sentence first, have supporting detail sentences, and then a concluding sentence. In fact, much of what we read, most paragraphs don't have a concluding sentence at the end of every paragraph. You might see a conclusion at the end of multi-paragraphs, the end of an article, let's say, but not always a concluding sentence. But when we're starting with younger children or older kids who don't get the concept, it's okay to talk about this topic sentence, concluding, and the middle. And I'm sure some of you have seen visuals like this, the old hamburger, right? Where the top part of the bun is the topic sentence, the bottom part of the bun is the restatement, and all the stuff inside the sandwich, the details, are the supporting sentences. So what kinds of activities can we do to help kids grow to understand a paragraph? And a lot of this is going to come down to main ideas. Many of our students have difficulty because they still don't get the difference between a main idea and supporting relevant information. So we can do color coding. I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute. We can do activities where we take a paragraph and we take the sentences and scramble them all up. One of them is the topic sentence that tells you the main idea, and the others are supporting, and the students have to identify it. You could also give them a bunch of supporting sentences and have them create a topic sentence. And then finally, you can give sentences that are related in a paragraph, but throw in a sentence about something else. So for example, on a very simple level, we could have a bunch of sentences about snakes, maybe about how snakes molt, that's our main idea. And all of a sudden we throw a sentence in about birds. It's a very obvious, but all of that gets them to be thinking about main ideas. So here's an example of what I meant about color coding. And this also is an example of how you can use model text. So this is a paragraph from a science textbook, and it just was beautifully structured. So I decided to use it as an example. We would work the students through and say, which sentence tells you the main idea? Happens to be the first one. We're going to color code it green. Which ones are supporting that with details? Those are yellow. And in this case, there is a concluding sentence, so we'll make it red. Now, eventually you want students to be thinking about this when they write their own paragraphs. And if you say to them, okay, you've written a paragraph, I want you to color code the elements. So that's your takeaway for paragraph. I want to share a little bit about patterns of organization and transitions. I mentioned before, there are 5 major ones. And again, a simple little poster or anchor chart that lets kids know these different approaches, different structures, and the purpose and how you use them can be really helpful. In fact, one of the best ways to teach this is through what the students are reading. It's called reading like a writer. So if you have a textbook and there's a really great example of a descriptive paragraph or a cause and effect, you would have the students read it, you talk about it, and you say, what makes you see that it's description versus a sequence? And part of the trick to that is focusing on the transition words, which I mentioned before. They clarify things, they enable students to make connections between paragraphs and subparagraphs. Now, I've got a little URL here at the bottom of the screen. This is a list of transition words, and they're organized by purpose. The list that you see on the right, I've been using since 1978. And, you know, once through the internet, I was able to have a website for Keys to Literacy where we have a whole bunch of free resources. Now I can distribute this free to anybody, and there are literally thousands of copies of this out there. So I suggest and I recommend you download it, make a copy of it. Look, I have older sons now, but it was not easy getting them to write when they were in school. And I put a copy of this above their desk. And whenever they did any writing, I insisted you must include at least 2 transitions. So download the list, make it available. If you work with younger children, you can cut it down. Don't put as many examples. It's overwhelming. On the left, you see a copy of, we actually turned this into a poster that you can also purchase at Keys to Literacy. All right, so we have 2 strands left. We're gonna now move down to, actually it's kind of text structure, but it's at the simplest level, syntax. And what does this mean? This is all about sentences. You know, teachers who say, where do you teach grammar in this rope? Well, there's a couple things to say about grammar, but this is the place where we talk about grammar, right? So our goal here with instruction on this strand in the rope is to make sure we develop an awareness, a syntactic awareness for students so that the sentences they write are grammatically correct. But it's also where we teach them strategies to write as they get older, longer and more elaborated and more interesting sentences. So let's delve a little bit more into this issue of sentences. I'm using this slide here to share with you a metaphor that I've used for a long time. I've used it with students, I've used it with educators. And if you think about it, when you see a piece of text, maybe it's an article in the newspaper or something in a textbook, or, you know, maybe it's something from someone's diary, right? Oftentimes students look at this and they go, oh, I could never do that. You know, like, how did they build that piece of text? Well, when you make them realize that all authors, whether they're good writers or not, right? How do they do it? They slowly, it's like building blocks. You take a few blocks, you put them together, and then you just keep building out. So let's use Legos as a metaphor for this. And sometimes when I'm actually training teachers, we will have Legos and manipulate them. Imagine that every one of these that you see on the screen, every block is one word. And so over on the right, you can see that we've put 4 of them together. This would be a very simple sentence with just 4 words. Now, syntax tells us that we have to put them in a certain order. So for example, in English, we put our adjectives in front of our noun. So I would look at this desk I'm on and I would say the flat white table. I wouldn't say the table flat white because that doesn't sound good to our ears, right? It's not grammatically correct. So we string words together to make a sentence, but we have to be careful of the order. Now we've got a sentence. How do we build a paragraph? Well, we're going to take 3 or 4 or 5 of those sentences and imagine me taking those stacks and putting them right next to each other. That's a bunch of sentences that are all about the same main idea. But to hold that together, we might take one of those big Lego blocks that's got a lot of holes in it, right? And put it on top to hold all those sentences together. That's like the topic sentence, the main idea. And we might put one on the base to hold it together even better. And that's like the conclusion. Now, how do we write something with multi-paragraphs? Picture this big chunk of blocks we've got now. And what do? We attach 4 or 5 or however many we need to build out an article or a chapter in a book. And we might, again, take a really big connecting piece, and that might be the introduction to our article and the conclusion. So if we can get kids to realize that we literally build from words and sentences, and I think what this metaphor does is it emphasizes to all of us that if students don't get it right at the sentence level or the paragraph level, then their writing will never be what they want it or need it to be. So we have to put attention on making sure they know how to write good sentences. Now let's explore this term syntax. It means the system and arrangement of words, phrases, or clauses that make up a sentence in any given language. Now, syntactic awareness means someone has an understanding of that grammar. They can use it so that when they speak, they apply that grammar to the sentences they speak. And when they write, they do the same thing. It's called developing a sentence sense or an ear for what sounds right. Now, if you think about it, one by one, our sentences, whether we speak them or write them, that's how we communicate the ideas that come together to make meaning. And so we really want to encourage our kids to think about what makes a really strong sentence. Now, the whole issue of grammar instruction, and Stephen Graham and colleagues have done a lot of work with this, and you'll see it in those research reports that I mentioned. It turns out that what's often referred to as traditional grammar, meaning teaching kids to label parts of speech or to be able to say that's an independent clause, that's a dependent clause, guess what? That doesn't help their writing. So less traditional ways, and that includes things like sentence combining, which I'll show you in a moment. Those kinds of things actually do a much better job of having students in the end learn to write better sentences. This is a quote from Bruce Sadler, who's done a lot of work and has written a book. Just Google Bruce Sadler sentence writing, his stuff will come up. But I love this quote from him. Of the many difficulties writers encounter when engaged in the complex act of writing, crafting sentences that accurately convey the intended meaning is particularly challenging. Manipulating sentences is both effortful and critical. And I want you to think about when you write several sentences and you're revising something, how much of your revision is about making sure you get your sentences right. So when we teach sentence building skills, we should have 2 goals in mind. The first is to develop fluency for writing sentences that have the basics, that they have a subject predicate, that they're not fragments, right? So we want kids to get in the habit of writing solid sentences so that they can focus their attention on making meaning with the rest of what they write. But we also want to focus on helping them write longer, elaborated sentences. Now, there are a number of activities we can do with students. I've got 4 of them listed here. You'll also see that I've got a URL. And this is to a 2-part series. Every month I write a literacy blog. It's called Literacy Lines. And I pick a subject. In this case, I devoted 2 of them to sharing teaching tips, right? And bringing in some research tips. So these 2, if you want to get into this a little bit more than we can tonight, go find these 2 blog entries and you'll see detailed instructions for all of them. We only have time for me to share one of them, and that's sentence combining. So this actually has been studied for quite some time. I remember back in the mid to late 70s when I was teaching students with dyslexia, I discovered the work of William Strong, who was one of the first to put out sort of like a book for how you could do this. It's funny, the cover on it has people with bell bottoms, and it was clearly written in the 60s. But basically, we studied a long time, and the research over and over again shares with us that when we do this, and this is with kindergarten all the way up through college, it improves not only their writing, but it actually improves their reading comprehension. Because as you'll see in a minute, the students are having to manipulate pieces of sentences and really critically think about how they come together and come apart. And that helps their comprehension as well. So the easiest way for me to show you a few examples, you can try this one, speak it out loud, nobody can hear you. Combine these two into one sentence. And perhaps you come up with something like this. Or combine these two. And perhaps you come up with something like this. Now, there's no rules. Like I could say the girl was thirsty, so she drank lemonade, right? As long as you get the concepts. Here's another one. When we introduce sentence combining to kids, we start with two short, simple sentences. And then depending on their grade and their ability, and as they become more developmentally able, we then make them combine 3 short sentences, and then 3 sentences that are a little longer, right? And we keep building up and building up. Eventually, we can get to the point where we do something like this. This is actually a really long, complex sentence from a science textbook. And what the teacher does, and what I did in this example here, is I broke it out into, in this case, 7 short, simple sentences. And now the task is, can you combine all of these into one long, complex sentence? It's not easy. And what you find is you're going to be manipulating words. You're going to try them out. You're going to say, wild are public lands. No, maybe public and private lands. And you're going to be moving these things around. And that's what we want students to do. So that's the fastest example I can give you of how you use sentence combining, but it really has a powerful effect on things. All right, so now we're going to shift gears to the very last of the strands in the reading rope, and this is critical thinking. So there are quite a few things like text structure that I put in under this. One of the first has to do with teaching students the stages of the writing process. And I'm going to share something you can use with students in a minute that will help you with that. But it also includes, and that's the very first bullet, any skills and strategies students need as they are generating ideas or gathering information for writing. It's the critical thinking part of writing. Maybe they're writing a story that they're creating. Well, this is the brainstorming they have to do about the characters and what's the plot summary. Maybe, and this often is what they need to do for writing in the content areas, maybe they're writing from sources. So maybe they've read something and they have to write a summary of it. Or maybe they've read several things, they're given a prompt, they have to find the information in the sources in order to answer the prompt. So it's the really thinking part of writing. Let's come back to the stages of the writing process. Now, these have been around and studied for a long time too. Several years back, my colleagues and I at Keys to Literacy, we came up with a simple little acronym to help kids remember the stages of the writing process, the process writing routine. And as you can see, the first letter of each of those words represents think, plan, write, and revise. And under that, there are several things. So at the think stage, this is where you're identifying your audience, your purpose. You're going to brainstorm what you want to say, gather information. Note-taking skills are really important. Planning, this is where you're going to organize your idea, and you might use a planning guide like a graphic organizer or like that topic web that I shared. At the writing stage, this is where all your knowledge about how to write good sentences and paragraphs and use transitions. And then finally at the revise, that's where we review and revise the content. And then we also proofread for conventions. And there's an arrow to remind us that while we can talk about these as happening in order, in reality, very often what happens is proficient writers often jump back to an earlier stage. So they might be at the writing stage and realize that they haven't collected enough information at the think stage. And so they go back to it. Now, that's what I was saying about the recursive process. All right, so can you hang on for 1 second? Excuse me, but I'm on a seminar. Hold on a second. Excuse me, I'm on a seminar. That's the husband talking. Okay, so a little bit more about writing to learn. And I mentioned this report earlier, the Writing to Read report, that identified how effective it is if we have students writing about what they read, writing personal reactions to a text, writing summaries, or taking notes, or writing answers to questions. And again, this all falls under the critical thinking strand. So writing is thinking, right? I want you to think about this. If you are going to the supermarket, how many of you write a list for yourself? Some of you just kind of write things down random. Some of you are a little more compulsive and you put all the frozen food together, right? All the canned goods together. But my point is, let's say you forget the list at home. The very fact that you wrote the list, how much of that helps you remember what you need when you get to the supermarket? And that's the point. When we write, it pushes us to organize our thoughts and clarify what we're thinking. We build relationships, right? We engage with the information. So the more we can have students write about what they're thinking and learning, the better it's going to be. Even little quick writes. Quick writes are things like, you've got 5 minutes, do a blank brain dump, everything you can remember from our lesson today. It can be as simple as that, right? Even quick writes are helpful. So what are some of the skills we need to teach kids in order to write to learn or write from sources? Well, some of this is comprehension. We have to teach them how to search and find the appropriate information in a text and maybe annotate it. We have to teach them how to take notes. Then how do they organize that into a graphic organizer? Then how do they turn each of those ideas in the notes into sentences and good paragraphs, which means they have to know text structure, right? And we have to teach them revising and editing. All of these things we don't want to take for granted. And as I said before, often this is a combination of comprehension and writing that produces quality responses. So we are getting close to the end here. I want to leave you with a few words about summarizing, which out of all the writing about learning tasks, I really like to promote because it's shown in the research to improve comprehension as well as writing. But we have to start by making sure that students know what a summary is, that it's a life skill, to be able to summarize to somebody the movie you just saw, right? So we have to be very explicit about our instruction. We can't have to teach them about main ideas because summaries are based on main ideas. So all that work we did in paragraphs, if they can find the main idea of each of the paragraphs that they're reading and then put them together to write their summary, it's going to be helpful. We want to give explicit instruction, right? So this is an example of a set of how-to steps. This is what you have to do to write a summary. You have to be very explicit. All right, so in closing, so that we still have at least 5 minutes for some questions, here are the big ideas I want you to take away from what I've been sharing about the writing rope. Number one, that writing instruction must address different components. Now, tonight, we've been talking about each one separately. We have to remember to find time to show kids how to integrate all of these at the same time. Because in order to write a good piece of writing, like the strands in the rope, they all have to be integrated and happen at the same time. Second big idea, every teacher can play a role, and parents. This is not just for an English teacher. We want to be explicit. And then the last thing is avoid assumicide. Now, that's not a real word, but I think you can guess what it means. The older students get, the more we assume that they have some of these basic underlying skills, and that could be spelling, handwriting, sentence writing, transitions, paragraphs, right? We can't assume that they have those skills. So with that, I'm going to go to our ending slide. There's the link to the free resources I mentioned, to my blog, and there's the link. I have a page at my website that has a book study so that if you want to purchase the writing rope from Brooks Publishing, you can have a book study. All right, so the gals from Northern New England, you want to jump in? You have some questions?
We sure do. Joan, this has been just amazing. We're getting so many amazing comments, and people are excited about all of the resources. And
Great.
I know that Christine has been compiling them on another document that she will post. Christine, you want to talk about that real quick?
Hang on a second. When we post this webinar and the presentation, I'll also post the document that I've created on our IDA-NNEA website. It's happened in about a week.
Yeah. So I think we have time for just a couple of questions, and one of them. Oh, what was that? Oh, sorry. One of them was about metacognition. So how do you build metacognition for students, as many students don't have that internal voice or don't know what it means to create a scaffold or system? What are the better or appropriate activities that will help students understand their internal voice or what they may be writing for someone else?
Yeah, so gosh, there's a lot to that, to an answer for that. I mean, metacognition, its simplest form is thinking about thinking, right? And throughout tonight, I keep emphasizing explicit instruction. And a hallmark of explicit instruction is at what's called the I do it stage, right? So if I'm trying to teach students how to use a graphic organizer, how to write, state their claim, any of the things that I talked about tonight, the teacher can't just say, okay, this is what a claim looks like, start writing them. You can't make that assumption. So how do we teach it? We use think aloud, and we model, and we stand up at the front of the class. And as we're writing out that introduction, we are literally thinking out loud. And what is that? We're being metacognitive to show and model for the students what they have to think as they are doing that. The graphic organizer is a perfect example, because I think the question included something about planning. You can't just give them a graphic organizer. You literally have to show them how to do it, and then provide opportunities for them to work with maybe a peer, so they create one together and tell each other, why did you put this in this place? Why did you add another item here? So the way you develop metacognition is by modeling it through think aloud. I think that's the simplest answer.
Absolutely. That is so important, to open up what we're thinking and show the kids make mistakes. I think that's huge too. I always
Yes.
tell my teachers, oh, I made a mistake, or this is what I do when I write.
Yeah.
And the kids love that. So we have another question about the top-down organizer. Would this work with elementary age children, say 3rd grade?
Yes, it absolutely can. It's going to be simpler. I'm going to stop sharing. It's going to be simpler. So for example, there's another book that I wrote several years back called Keys to Early Writing, and it goes with our training for K-2 teachers. And we talk about how, so let's say, even it's a 1st grader, right? Who say you want them to write about the 4 seasons of the year. So you give them 4 seasons is up on top, and you give them 4 big boxes, and you say, draw a little picture in each box that represents each season. And these are kids that maybe can't even write the words yet, right? And then underneath each one, they write 1 or 2 words, or they dictate to the teacher. That's your topic web. They just used it, For 3rd graders, maybe you want them to write about 2 things. So the topic web will have, they put their topic in the topic here. Then they have just 2 boxes. You put some big lines for them to write, and they write a couple of keywords. Maybe they want to talk about dogs and cats as pets. So they write a couple of things about dogs and a couple of things about cats. And guess what? Now they have a graphic organizer to write a few sentences about dogs and cats. So you can start it at a very young age, and you can have high schoolers. Look, I've had adults, teachers who are, doing their dissertation tell me that they went home and built out on their wall a huge top-down web to plan the whole structure of their dissertation. So it can go from that simplest level all the way on up.
That's awesome. So we have some more questions, but you know what? They're all written in this document that Chris is answering questions and is going to upload. So I think we're just about at time. If we want to close out, Susan, and Joan, thank you so, so much.
You're welcome and good evening, everybody.
Susan, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joan, for sharing that wonderful advice. I can't wait to use it with some of my students. Our upcoming Read for Parents, April 8th, is to be determined. We're currently finalizing our next presenter. If you're on our mailing list, keep an eye on your email and we'll share this information shortly. In June, like was mentioned earlier, one of the IDA-NNEA members will present Dyslexia 101. A lot of great information about that. We have the Truth About Reading film premiere, so the information is here. We're going to have at least one in each state. No, couple already booked for New Hampshire. And please complete the survey at the end of the session. Thank you again so much, Joan. We appreciate you spending this time with us.
Sure.
Have a great night, everybody.